Question: describe and comment on Coleridge's definition of a poem and of poetry and the role he assigns to the imagination in the poetic process. Coleridge's views on poetry has been elaborated in chapter XIV of the Biographia Literaria. Here, Coleridge discusses, along with some other important points, the differences between a poem and poetry. Poetry, for him, is basically an activity of the imagination that takes place in the poet's mind. A poem is merely one of the forms of the expression of this act. Poetry is a wider category than that of a poem for him. So, poetry in its large sense brings the whole soul of man into activity, with each faculty playing its proper role according to its relative worth and dignity. The act of poetry bears resemblance to the act of painters, scientists, philosophers. Coleridge's discussion on these two aspects is artistic, psychological, and philosophical. According to Coleridge, poetry is the outcome of a poetic process into which poet's own mind works. In this act of artistic creation, imagination plays the primary role and fancy plays the secondary role. Coleridge terms imagination a magical and synthetic power that fuse and harmonize the raw materials provided by fancy and reconciles the elements of opposition like feelings and thoughts, head and heart. It is imagination which, like the soul, animates its part and forms one graceful whole. Fancy provides the external dress of a poem. However, fancy is inferior to imagination because it is not a creative power and does not fuse things like imagination. It only combines different things into pleasing shapes. In making poetry, it functions like a memory box controlled by the order of time and place. This is how different elements go into making a poetry. Coleridge's definition of poetry, however, conforms to the romantic start of writing poetry. Early in Biographia Literaria, Coleridge has elucidated his views on two faculties, fancy and imagination. It was Wordsworth's poem Guilt and Sorrow that led him to meditate upon these two terms and come to the conclusion that imagination and fancy are two different faculties and not two names with different meanings. Wordsworth agrees with the view that fancy and imagination are two kinds of human faculties. Still, there is a difference between the thoughts of these two contemporary poets regarding this subject. While Wordsworth has generalized the ideas of fancy and imagination, Coleridge has segregated them and showed two distinct qualities of imagination, shaping and modifying. According to Coleridge, imagination has two forms, primary and secondary. The primary imagination is a lower kind of imagination which is possessed by all. It is merely the power of receiving impression from the external world through the senses. It is an inactive and unconscious act of the mind. Through the primary imagination, the mind gets a clear image of the outside world. The secondary imagination, on the other hand, is a higher kind of imagination which is not possessed by all but by the poets of genius. It is active and conscious in its working. It requires will and conscious effort. It works upon the sensation and impression supplied to it by the primary imagination. The secondary imagination selects and orders the materials of the primary imagination and reshape them into objects of beauty. Thus, secondary imagination refers to the shaping and modifying power. It dissolves and diffuses materials in order to create something new. However, secondary imagination is the fundamental requirement of any poetic creation. According to Coleridge, fancy is the inferior of the two forms of imagination. It is not a creative power. It only combines different things into pleasing shapes and does not fuse them into one like secondary imagination. It a memory controlled by the order of time and place. It receives all its materials from ready-made from the law of association. Coleridge has described in which fancy and imagination function. The well-known illustration is taken from the meeting between Venus and Adonis. In Shakespeare's narrative poem, the white hands of Venus have taken hold those of Adonis, which the poet pictures as a lily imprisoned in a jail of snow. This is the work of fancy that has brought together lily and snow simply because they are superficially alike for the whiteness of color. Then comes the picture Adonis, who is bright and young. He was darting into the darkness from the side of anxious Venus. Look how a bright star shouted from the sky, so glides he in the night from Venus' eyes. This is the working of imagination where so many ideas are fused to create the image of charming Adonis plunged in the darkness, creating anxiety in the face of amorous Venus. Fancy is equated with mechanical mixture and imagination is equated with chemical compound. In a mechanical mixture, a number of ingredients are brought together. They are mixed up, but they do not lose their individual identities. In a chemical compound, on the other hand, different ingredients combine to form something new. They lose their individual identities and fuse together to create something new and entirely different. From the above illustration of fancy and imagination, some noticeable distinction between them can be sorted out. Fancy is light and fanciful, while imagination is grave and solemn. Fancy plays with the static things and does not modify them, while imagination dissolves and reshapes. them into new wholes. Fancy is regulated by the principle of choice irrespective of time and place, but imagination is regulated by interpretation, not mere aggregation of images. For Coleridge, fancy is the dress of poetic genius, while imagination is its very soul. Coleridge owed to Wordsworth for his interest in the study of these two faculties, but afterwards he surpassed the latter for his elaborate and in-depth interpretation of the same. Wordsworth was interested in the theory of poetry, but Coleridge was interested in the theory of imagination. He is the first critic to study the nature of imagination and examine its role in creative activity. While Wordsworth uses fancy and imagination almost as synonymous, Coleridge distinguishes them and defines their respective roles. Even Wordsworth has not differentiated imagination like Coleridge into two kinds. Thus, in many respects, Coleridge's interpretation is superior to that of Wordsworth. From the above discussion, conclusion may be drawn that Coleridge's idea on fancy and imagination is unique, original, and complete in itself. The discussion that started in the 17th century regarding fancy and imagination probably gets a complete form here in Biographia Literaria. His judgment that imagination is superior and sophisticated to fancy is fair and logical. Prior to Coleridge, no poet dissected and analyzed these two terms so minutely.